What happens when a young law student takes on a powerful judge and uncovers deep corruption? Will she survive the threats, or will the system silence her? Maya Johnson's fight for justice could change everything. How far will she go to expose the truth? Find out what happens next in this shocking tale of courage and power. Stay tuned to H2 Black Thread for more. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Maya Johnson stood outside the courthouse, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She was just a third-year law student, barely out of the classroom and already stepping into a world that many of her peers only dreamt of. But here she was, preparing to face off against some of the most powerful people in the city. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She wasn't even officially a lawyer yet, and the thought of representing someone in court seemed ridiculous to some. Yet, she couldn't turn back now. Mrs. Clara Jenkins, the elderly woman who had trusted her to represent her, was counting on her. Maya took a deep breath, clutching the leather briefcase she borrowed from her professor. It felt heavy in her hand, though it was almost empty. All she had were her notes, her passion for justice, and a case that she'd spent the last few weeks pouring every ounce of her energy into. But despite the feeling of inadequacy, Maya felt a fire ignite in her chest. She was ready for this. No matter what anyone said, she wasn't going to let Mrs. Jenkins down. As she walked through the courthouse doors, the hum of conversation, the shuffle of shoes, and the distant sound of a gavel echoed around her. Maya felt out of place. This wasn't her world. She was still a student. Yet when she looked around at the suits and briefcases, she knew she belonged here. This was where change could happen. She was ready to be part of that change. When she entered the courtroom, the first person she locked eyes with was Judge Davis. He was already seated, flipping through some papers, exuding an air of superiority. He looked up briefly, sizing her up with a dismissive glance, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. Maya's heart skipped a beat, but she held her ground, pushing back the nerves that crept up her throat. The moment she walked to the front of the room, she felt the stares from the opposing counsel, the prosecutor, and even the few spectators who'd gathered. They all seemed to share the same thought: who was this girl? A teenager trying to play lawyer in a courtroom filled with professionals. Maya couldn't help but hear Judge Davis's voice in her head. "A little young, aren't we?" The words came out with the perfect mix of mockery and amusement. There were a few chuckles from the courtroom, and she could feel the heat of their judgment. But she didn't flinch. Not this time. She straightened her shoulders, ignored the whispers, and responded confidently. "Maya Johnson, representing Mrs. Clara Jenkins, Your Honor." Her voice was steady, but she could hear the slight quiver in it as she spoke her name aloud. The courtroom rippled with laughter. There it was again, Judge Davis's dismissive chuckle, followed by a few muttered comments from the gallery. "What is this? An intern? This is a joke." Olivia fought the urge to shrink under the weight of the ridicule. Instead, she stood tall. No one here was going to make her feel small. She had studied this case in and out, had spent countless hours researching the law, reading precedent after precedent. This was her moment. She would not let anyone take it from her. Judge Davis leaned back in his chair, clearly amused by the situation. "Well then, let's get this over with. This should be good." His voice was dripping with sarcasm. He waved his hand, signaling for Maya to begin. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't show any signs of doubt. Instead, she stepped forward, adjusting the notes in her hands. She took a deep breath and launched into her argument. Maya began by outlining the terms of the lease agreement that her client, Mrs. Jenkins, had signed with her landlord. The agreement was clear. The eviction was unlawful. With each point, she noticed the atmosphere in the room shift slightly. At first, the opposition seemed confident, but now their scribbled notes stopped, and their heads began to turn slightly towards her. Her words were having an impact. Maya referenced case law, citing precedents that were directly applicable to her case. She spoke with the precision of someone who had studied tirelessly. She knew her stuff. She wasn't just a kid playing lawyer. She was a law student on a mission to ensure justice was served. As she continued, Maya felt the weight of the courtroom begin to lift. The chuckles that had filled the room were replaced with uncomfortable silence. Then came the moment that changed everything. Judge Davis, who had been so smug just moments before, flipped through his own notes. His face started to change. She saw it, his arrogance slipping just a little. But she wasn't done yet. Maya pressed on, calmly referencing the 2017 case Patterson v. United States, where a similar statute had been overturned. She pointed out how the eviction laws protected tenants from fraudulent actions like the ones Mrs. Jenkins had been subjected to. She felt a thrill when she saw the judge stop flipping through his notes. He looked up at her with a sharp glance. "What do you mean, overturned?" His voice was now sharp, the amusement fading from his tone. Maya's heart pounded, but she didn't waver. She had him right where she wanted him. "You misquoted precedent, Your Honor," she said firmly, holding his gaze. For the first time since she'd stepped into the courtroom, there was silence. The prosecutor, who had been scribbling away on a notepad, now sat up straighter, glancing between Maya and the judge. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Maya didn't back down. She knew exactly what she was talking about, and Judge Davis couldn't ignore that. Judge Davis's fingers twitched, his face turning pale. He cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the room. But it was too late. The damage had been done. "Who are you?" Judge Davis finally asked, his voice low and tight. Maya smiled inwardly, but she didn't let her emotions show. "I'm your worst nightmare, Judge," she said coolly. The courtroom erupted. The tension in the room had shifted. No one was laughing anymore. Maya's confidence, her knowledge, and her composure had shattered the judge's ironclad authority. It was a victory in that moment, small but powerful. She may have been young, she may have been inexperienced, but she had done something that no one thought possible. She had earned their respect. As she walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the moment hit her all at once. She had won, not just for Mrs. Jenkins, but for herself. Maya knew this was only the beginning. She had proven that she was more than just a law student. She was a force to be reckoned with. But as the door closed behind her, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. This case wasn't over, and neither was her fight for justice. Maya sat at her desk that evening, the adrenaline from the courtroom still coursing through her veins. The papers in front of her were a blur, but she couldn't bring herself to focus. It had been an overwhelming day, a win, an unexpected one. She had done the impossible. She had stood before a room full of experienced attorneys and a smug judge who didn't think twice about her, only to prove him wrong in every single way. Mrs. Jenkins was safe, her rights restored. For that, Maya felt a sense of pride that she had never known before. But as the hours ticked by, the euphoria of the victory began to wane. The reality of what had just happened started to settle in. The phone buzzed, signaling a new notification. Maya glanced at it distractedly. The news had spread faster than she could have imagined. The headline flashed across her phone screen. "Teen legal prodigy shocks courtroom, exposes judge's mistake." Maya couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and unease. She had won, but it wasn't just a legal battle. It was a political one. She ran her hand through her hair, trying to push the creeping thoughts aside. Mrs. Jenkins was safe. That's what mattered, right? But the weight of the consequences kept pulling her back. She could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from her best friend, Kayla. "OMG, Maya, you're trending. You've got to see this news clip." Maya's heart sank. She clicked the link, and there it was, the shaky video from the courthouse. It was grainy. the camera jostling as someone recorded the moment she corrected Judge Davis. She could hear herself in the background, her voice firm and unwavering, and then the judge's stunned silence when she proved him wrong. The clip ended with her coolly declaring, "I'm your worst nightmare, Judge." She stared at the screen for a long moment. The world had seen her, heard her, and now there was no turning back. Maya took a deep breath and tried to ignore the chill that ran down her spine. She wasn't naive. She knew the kind of power Judge Davis wielded. And power like that didn't let go easily. The phone buzzed again. Another notification. This one was a voicemail, and the name attached to it made her stomach drop. It was from an unknown number. Maya hesitated for a second, her thumb hovering over the play button. Finally, she pressed it. The voice on the other end was low, calculated, and unmistakably menacing. "You've made a big mistake, little girl." Maya froze. Her hand trembled slightly as the voice continued, slow and deliberate. "You don't know who you're messing with. Stay out of it or things are gonna get worse. You've been warned." The voicemail ended abruptly. Maya felt a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. She didn't even know what to say or how to feel. Was this some kind of sick joke? Her mind raced, but a sense of dread slowly began to settle over her. This wasn't just a random threat. This was personal. She sat in the silence for a long time, her heart hammering in her chest. This wasn't the legal system she had imagined when she started law school. She thought of fighting for justice, of standing up for the little guy. But she never thought it would mean dealing with threats, dealing with powerful figures who would go to any lengths to protect their own interests. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She jumped in her seat, her heart skipping a beat. Maya stood up, moving to the door cautiously, her mind racing. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door to find her mother standing there, her face lined with concern. "Maya, we need to talk." Her mother's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that made Maya's chest tighten. "What is it, Mom?" Maya asked, trying to act nonchalant, but the anxiety bubbling up inside her made it hard to hide the tremor in her voice. Her mother stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. She looked around the small apartment, her eyes scanning the room before meeting Maya's. "I've been getting calls," her mother said quietly. "People who want to know what you've been up to." Maya swallowed hard. "What kind of calls?" her mother sighed. "People who don't like what you did today. You're a topic of conversation now, Maya. You've stirred up something big." Maya's stomach twisted. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. She wasn't just some kid challenging a corrupt judge anymore. She had become a target, and this wasn't some passing dispute. This was a game that the powerful were playing, and Maya had just stepped into the ring. "What do I do, Mom?" Maya asked, her voice breaking for the first time since she'd stepped into that courtroom. The weight of what she had set in motion was too much to bear alone. Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You keep fighting, but you need to be careful. This isn't just about winning a case. This is about survival now." Maya nodded, but a part of her felt hollow. This wasn't what she had expected. She had fought for justice because it was the right thing to do. She hadn't signed up for this, hadn't signed up to be threatened, harassed, and dragged into a game where the stakes were life or death. The next morning, Maya received another call. This one was from a local reporter, someone she had never spoken to before. The tone was polite, but there was an undercurrent of something else, a hint of danger in their voice. "Maya, we'd like to do an interview about your case. It's made quite an impact, and we'd love to hear your thoughts." Maya hesitated. There was something about the way the reporter asked, the way the words came out too smoothly, that made her feel uneasy. She could almost hear the underlying message: "This is bigger than you, Maya." "I'm not interested," Maya replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "Not now, not unless it's about Mrs. Jenkins." The reporter's voice softened, but there was a sharpness beneath it. "Just be careful, Maya. People are watching." The line went dead before she could respond. Maya hung up the phone, her thoughts spinning. She had no idea what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain: this battle wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about power. And now she was a part of a much larger struggle. She looked out the window at the city streets below. People were going about their lives, unaware of the storm that was brewing. Maya wasn't going to back down. She knew this was only the beginning. But as she turned back to face the quiet apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had changed forever. She wasn't just a law student anymore. She was a target, and this fight had just begun. The morning after the unsettling phone call, Maya awoke with a sense of quiet tension hanging over her. She hadn't slept well, not because she wasn't exhausted, but because her mind wouldn't stop racing. The constant hum of the city below her window was drowned out by the weight of everything that had happened over the last few days. She had taken on a powerful system, and now that system was pushing back in ways she never anticipated. It was one thing to be in the courtroom fighting for a cause. It was another thing entirely to be thrust into the crosshairs of the very people who controlled that system. Her phone buzzed incessantly that morning. More calls, more messages. Maya glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be another threatening message or perhaps an article about her. But it wasn't. It was a simple text from her professor. "Maya, I need to talk to you. Can you meet today? Important." A chill ran down her spine. She had worked with Professor Hall for the last 3 years, and although she knew he had her best interests at heart, his cryptic message made her feel uneasy. After a long hesitation, Maya grabbed her jacket and stepped out into the chilly morning, her mind spinning. The cafe down the street was quiet when she arrived. She spotted Professor Hall immediately, his graying hair and well-worn blazer making him look more like a lawyer than a law professor. He waved her over, his face serious, and Maya took a seat across from him. "Maya," he began, his voice low, "I've been asked to pass along a message to you." Maya raised an eyebrow. "A message?" "Yes," he replied, his eyes scanning the room. "From a group of influential business leaders. They've taken notice of your case and they want to help you." Maya's stomach tightened. She had no idea who these people were, but she could feel the weight of his words. "Help me? How?" Professor Hall paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "They want you to drop the case. Let it go. In return, they're offering you something substantial: a full scholarship to finish your law degree, exclusive job offers, and connections to people who can secure your future in the legal world. Your career would be set. All you have to do is walk away." Maya blinked, her mind reeling. The offer was too good to be true, too easy. A full scholarship, she thought, connections to powerful people, job offers. It sounded like a dream, but Maya wasn't naive. This was no simple act of charity. This was a bribe, and they were offering her a chance to sell out. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers curling into the fabric of her jacket. The idea of a smooth, guaranteed future was tempting. She could finish law school, secure a prestigious job, and maybe even live a life free of the constant battle she had fought so far. But that wasn't who she was. Maya hadn't fought this hard just to roll over and accept an easy out. Not when she knew what was at stake. "I'm not walking away," Maya said, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about one lawsuit. This is about something bigger. It's about standing up to people like them, people who think they can control everything because they have power and money. I can't back down now." Professor Hall sighed, his face hardening. "Maya, this isn't some small-time case. These people are connected, powerful. They can make things difficult for you. They can ruin your career, your future. You think they'll just forget about this?" Maya shook her head. "I don't care about my future if it means I have to compromise who I am and what I stand for." Hall's eyes softened for a moment, but he didn't argue. "I wish you would reconsider. This could cost you everything." Maya looked him in the eye, her resolve unwavering. It already has, Professor. I've already lost everything I was. But if I walk away now, I lose everything that matters. There was a long silence between them, and Maya could see the conflict in Hall's eyes. He didn't understand. He couldn't. Maya's entire life had been built on the idea of doing the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it felt like she was alone in her fight. This was what she had signed up for, and she wouldn't let fear or threats make her back down. "You've made your decision, then," Hall said quietly, standing up from the table. "I can't stop you, but I want you to know this won't be easy. It will be a fight unlike anything you've faced before." Maya nodded. "I know, but I'm ready for it." As she left the cafe and walked down the street, Maya could feel a weight lifting off her shoulders. The offer had been tempting, no doubt. But in rejecting it, she had found a clarity she hadn't realized she was searching for. She wasn't doing this for fame or fortune. She wasn't doing it for any personal gain. She was doing this because it was the right thing to do. Later that afternoon, Maya received another unexpected visitor. A tall man in a well-tailored suit appeared at her door. He was clean-cut, with a smile that felt practiced, and he exuded a quiet but intense confidence that made her stomach turn. It was Marcus Calloway, the same man who had been behind the offer that Professor Hall had warned her about. "Miss Johnson," he said smoothly, offering her a business card, "I represent a group of individuals who are very interested in your future." Maya didn't take the card. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest and stood firm. "I told your associates already I'm not interested in your offer." Calloway didn't flinch. "I understand your position, Miss Johnson, but I'd like to talk to you in person. A conversation never hurts, does it?" She shook her head. "I'm not backing down. I'm not going to let you or anyone else intimidate me into giving up." For a moment, Calloway's smile faded. "Very well," he said, his tone turning colder. "But understand this. People like us don't make offers like this unless we expect something in return. You may be standing tall now, but one day you'll realize that there's more at stake here than just your case. People like you don't win against people like us." Maya didn't flinch. "Then I guess I'm just going to have to prove you wrong." With that, Calloway gave her one last look before turning and walking away. Maya stood in the doorway, watching him disappear into the distance. She knew what was coming. She knew that this wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about fighting against the very system that allowed people like Calloway and Judge Davis to thrive. But Maya was ready. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. Not now. Not ever. This was her fight, and she wasn't about to back down. Maya sat at her desk late that night, her eyes burning from hours of staring at legal texts, documents, and the pile of case files spread out in front of her. She had always been determined, but now, more than ever, she could feel the weight of the task ahead of her. She wasn't just up against a single corrupt judge. She was facing a deep-rooted system of injustice. A system that didn't just bend the law, it broke it. And if she was going to stand a chance, she needed more than just a case. She needed proof. The video from the courthouse was a small victory, but it wasn't enough. It had shown Judge Davis faltering, but Maya knew the real battle lay in uncovering the full extent of his corruption. The stakes were much higher now, and the enemies she was up against were not people who would quietly bow out. Her phone buzzed suddenly, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Daniel Hunter, the lawyer she'd contacted for help when things started spiraling out of control. He had been working with her behind the scenes, gathering legal information and resources to support her case. She'd grown to trust him. He had a quiet, focused energy that made him a formidable ally, but he also had a way of speaking plainly that made everything seem clearer. She picked up the phone immediately. "Maya, I think we've got something," Daniel said, his voice low but urgent. "I need you to come over. It's about Judge Davis." Maya felt her heart race. "What have you found?" I can't explain it all over the phone, just get here. I'll fill you in when you arrive. Without wasting another second, Maya grabbed her jacket and rushed out of her apartment, the weight of her resolve heavier with each step she took. She had been on edge for days now, knowing that the moment she unearthed something damning about Davis, it would make her a target. But she couldn't back down. Not after everything she'd fought for. Not after everything Davis had put her through. When she arrived at Daniel's office, she didn't waste any time. He was standing by his desk, flipping through a file. He looked up as she entered, his expression grim. "What is it?" Maya asked, her voice steady despite the flutter of nervous energy rising in her chest. Daniel handed her a thick file filled with bank statements, emails, and various other documents. "I've been digging into Davis's financials. It's worse than I thought. This isn't just about one bribery incident. He's been taking bribes for years, largely from corporations looking to secure favorable rulings. I think he's been using his position as a judge to make sure their business interests are protected at all costs." Maya skimmed the documents, her stomach churning as she read through each transaction. Payments from large corporations, large sums of money directed into personal accounts, all tied to rulings Davis had made that had undeniably benefited those corporations. She stared at one of the bank statements in disbelief. An offshore account, funneling money into a shell company that Davis had ownership of. This was not just bribery, it was systemic corruption. "Do you think this is enough to prove what we need?" Maya asked, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the pages. Daniel nodded slowly. "This is just the tip of the iceberg, but we're going to need more to build a solid case. I've got a lead on a video that could be crucial. It shows Davis accepting a bribe from a corporate executive in exchange for a favorable ruling." Maya's heart skipped a beat. "A video?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes darkening with the weight of what they were about to uncover. "Yes. I've got a contact who works in the building where Davis frequently meets with executives. He sent me a leaked clip. It's grainy, but it's clear enough to show what's going on." Maya's mind raced. If they could get their hands on that video, it would be the key they needed to bring down Davis and expose the corruption running through the judicial system. But she knew that accessing the video was risky. Whoever was leaking this information was clearly in danger, and they could easily disappear if they weren't careful. "Do you have it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. Daniel leaned over to his laptop, his fingers tapping quickly on the keyboard. A few moments later, the screen flickered, and a grainy video popped up. It was shaky, the lighting poor, but Maya could clearly see the scene unfolding. The clip showed Judge Davis meeting with two corporate executives in a dark corner of a restaurant. They exchanged briefcases, the kind that were often used for transporting money. The camera zoomed in as one of the executives handed Davis a thick envelope, which he quickly slipped into his coat pocket. The video was clear enough to see the moment of the transaction. There was no denying what was happening. "This is it," Maya whispered. "This is the proof we need." But as she watched the video, her heart began to race for a different reason. She wasn't just watching a corrupt judge take a bribe. She was watching the evidence that would put everything she had worked for at risk. If this video got out, there would be no going back. People would come after her after Daniel. She could already hear the threats, the voices warning her to stop before it was too late. "We can't just sit on this," Maya said, determination settling in her chest. "We need to get this out there. This can bring Davis down for good." Daniel gave her a long, calculating look. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Once we release this, it's out of our hands. We can't predict how they'll react." "They might come after you, Maya. They'll make sure you're silenced." Maya took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought of Mrs. Jenkins, of all the people who had been silenced by corruption. She thought of herself, standing there in the courtroom, fighting not just for a case but for the future. The moment she had exposed Davis in that courtroom had set a chain of events into motion, and there was no turning back now. "I'm ready," Maya said, her voice steady. "We can't stop now. We need to expose this for what it is, bring the whole system down if we have to." Daniel nodded, pulling out a flash drive. "Then we're in this together. Let's make sure they can't hide anymore." Maya took the drive from him, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just about exposing one corrupt judge. It was about showing the world that even the most powerful figures weren't untouchable. This was bigger than her. It was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. Together, they had the evidence. Now, it was time to bring it to light. As Maya left Daniel's office, the sense of urgency pressed down on her. She had taken on a corrupt judge and a broken system. But now, with the truth in her hands, she was ready to face whatever came next. This fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days that followed the release of the video were a blur of headlines, news alerts, and phone calls. Maya had known this was going to be a battle, but nothing could have prepared her for the storm that followed. The video showing Judge Davis accepting a bribe from corporate executives spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was the top story on every major news outlet. The grainy footage, although imperfect, was clear enough to leave no room for doubt. Davis's once unshakable authority crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Maya couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph when she saw the first news article. "Corrupt judge exposed. Video reveals bribe from corporations." It wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every person who had ever suffered at the hands of a system that was supposed to protect them, but instead fed off their misery. But the victory wasn't without its cost. Maya's phone rang non-stop for the next several days. She fielded calls from reporters, some respectful and others trying to get more out of her than she was willing to give. She knew they wanted to make her a sensation, turn her into some kind of hero for the cameras. But Maya wasn't interested in fame. She wasn't interested in the limelight. This was about something bigger than herself. And then, one morning, the news broke. Judge Davis had been arrested. The feeling that surged through Maya was indescribable. It was relief, yes, but it was also something deeper, a sense of justice that she could almost touch. She had spent days waiting for this moment, knowing that the forces she had exposed would do everything in their power to cover their tracks. But there was no escape for them now. Davis's involvement in widespread corruption was undeniable, and the video had sealed his fate. The authorities couldn't turn a blind eye anymore. The courthouse buzzed with activity the next day when Maya arrived, her heart pounding as she walked through the halls. It was an odd feeling, walking through these corridors where just days ago she had felt so out of place. But now she felt different. She wasn't just some student anymore. She was a symbol of something bigger. As she entered the courtroom, she caught sight of Mrs. Jenkins. The elderly woman had been so nervous about the case, but today she was smiling. Maya gave her a small, reassuring nod, and Mrs. Jenkins smiled back, her eyes filled with gratitude. The trial for Mrs. Jenkins's case was finally over. The eviction was overturned and her rights had been fully restored. But the courtroom was charged with something else now, an air of anticipation, of change. No one had expected a young woman still in law school to bring down a judge, and yet Maya had done just that. Maya stood at the back of the courtroom, her eyes locked on the seat where Judge Davis had once presided. It was empty now, gone. His name would be dragged through the mud for the rest of his life, and his role in the legal system was finished. But Maya wasn't thinking about him anymore. She was thinking about the future, about the next fight. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a reporter or a call from an anonymous number. It was a message from Daniel Hunter. "We did it. He's gone, but don't think this is over. There's still so much more to be done. You're just getting started, Maya." She smiled at the message, her chest swelling with pride. Daniel was right. This fight wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The press conference later that day was a whirlwind. Reporters crowded around her, their questions coming fast and furious. They all wanted to know the same thing: how had she done it? What was it like to bring down someone so powerful? Maya stood there, her back straight, answering each question with the same conviction that had carried her through this entire ordeal. She talked about the case, about the fight for justice, but she kept returning to one key point. This victory wasn't just about me. It was about all the people who have been ignored, silenced, and pushed aside. It's about the system that needs to change, and it's about making sure no one is above the law. The reporters were eating it up, but Maya didn't care. She wasn't doing this for them. She wasn't doing this for the cameras. She was doing it for everyone who didn't have a voice. She was doing it for the people who needed someone to fight for them when no one else would. After the press conference, Maya stepped out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sunlight. The weight of the past few days was heavy on her shoulders, but there was a certain lightness to it now. She had taken on a corrupt judge, exposed a system that allowed people like him to thrive, and had come out victorious. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger than a single case. Maya walked to the steps of the courthouse and paused, letting the sounds of the city wash over her. The bustling streets, the people rushing past, none of them knew what had just happened in that courtroom. They didn't know that a young woman had stood up and taken down one of the most powerful figures in the city. But that was okay. Maya didn't need anyone to recognize her. She didn't need the validation. She only needed to know that what she had done mattered. A reporter called her name from behind, and she turned to face him. He had the same eager look as the others, but this time, she wasn't interested in the questions he had to ask. Maya smiled, a quiet, confident smile, and said, "I'm not done yet." And with that, she turned, walking away from the steps, ready for whatever came next. The fight for justice was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Maya Johnson wasn't just a law student anymore. She was a force for change, and the world was watching.